Samuel Doe rose to power in Liberia through a bloody military coup which claimed the life of the then sitting president of the country. That was in 1980. A couple of years after, he was also removed in a bloody military coup which claimed his own life. In this edition of Back in History, we bring to you the story of Samuel Doe and how he rose to power to become the 21st president of Liberia. We also bring to you the story of how he was removed from office and executed by a group of soldiers led by Prince Johnson in yet another violent military coup in the country. Welcome to this edition of Back in History. Liberia is one of the oldest democracies in Africa. It was the first nation on the African continent to gain independence. This was in July 1847, when the United States of America accorded the country the status of an independent nation. From then on, Liberia has been governed by several persons as presidents, with periodic elections holding from time to time for purpose of transition from one administration to the other. It is important to mention that Liberia as a country is made up of the native African people whose forefathers were born in Liberia, and also made up of African Americans whose forefathers returned from America and settled in Liberia upon the abolition of slave trade and their discharge from slave plantations. The descendants of these African American race are the people commonly known in Liberia as, quote, Americo-Liberians. Right from time, the population of the Native American people in Liberia was far more than the population of the Americo-Liberians. But the Americo-Liberian population was a powerful minority group. Between 1847 and 1980, a period of 133 years, the Americo-Liberian citizens dominated the politics of Liberia and produced presidents in every election throughout this period. They consolidated power among themselves. They exercised overwhelming political power and dominance over every other group of people in Liberia. For all these years, no native Liberian African was able to clinch the presidency of the country. Neither were they able to occupy any sensitive political office in their land. In 1980, a native Liberian citizen broke this jinx and emerged as the first president of Liberia to come from outside the Americo-Liberian family. That native Liberian citizen was Samuel Canyon Doe. Unlike other presidents of Liberia, Doe did not pass through a democratic process. He passed through a coup, and the coup was bloody. The 12th day of April 1980 was like any other day for the ordinary citizen of Liberia. But for Samuel Doe and his co-conspirators, it was more than an ordinary day. It was a day set aside for the execution of a coup that had been carefully planned by Samuel Doe and his men. They invaded the Liberian executive mansion, and their principal target was the then president of the country, President William Talbot. They got hold of the president and had him executed. They overran the executive mansion, took complete charge of it, and Samuel Doe declared himself as the new president of the country. Samuel Doe then became the 21st president of the Republic of Liberia. Samuel Doe was a master sergeant in the armed forces of Liberia when he staged the coup. By this overthrow of President William Talbot, Samuel Doe became the first non-Americo-Liberian leader of Liberia, thus ending the 133 years of Americo-Liberian rule. This was a milestone achievement to which many native Liberians went into endless celebration. But it came with a cost. The sitting president was killed, so also were many of his supporters. Samuel Doe took charge of the country and commenced his administration in earnest. He had the support of several persons at the commencement of his administration, but he also had the resentment of many persons. He suspended the Constitution of Liberia and promoted himself to the rank of general from the lower rank of sergeant major. He established a provisional military government with himself as de facto head of state. Shortly after the coup, government ministers who served under the previous administration were walked publicly naked around Monrovia, the capital of Liberia, and summarily executed by firing squad on the beach. This action was widely criticized at home and abroad. Samuel Doe's regime was a typical example of a full-blown dictatorship. Hundreds of government workers fled the country, while others were imprisoned. As stated earlier, after the coup, Samuel Doe assumed the rank of general and established the People's Redemption Council, PRC, composed of himself and 14 other low-ranking officers, to rule the country of Liberia. The early days of the regime were marked by mass execution of members of late President Tolbert's deposed regime. Samuel Doe was seriously criticized for the high-handedness of his regime and his worrisome human rights record. Doe was defiant and went on with his administration as a military dictator as though nothing wrong was happening. In 1984, he lifted the ban on political activities, and in 1985, general election was conducted with Samuel Doe as one of the candidates. He was declared as the winner of the election amidst widespread irregularities. Doe was formally sworn in on 6 January 1986. On the day of his inauguration, Doe publicly declared that if he lost the election, he would not have handed over power and that the army would have carried out another coup with immediate effect. Samuel Doe continued to face growing opposition to his regime from several people in Liberia and in the United States. During his regime, the First Liberian Civil War began in December 1989 when the anti-Samuel Doe National Patriotic Front of Liberia, led by Charles Taylor and Prince Johnson, invaded Liberia from neighboring Ivory Coast. The mission of the invading forces was to overthrow Samuel Doe and end his government at all costs. The war lasted for several months, leading to the loss of many lives and property. In September 1990, Samuel Doe was captured by Prince Johnson. He was tortured and executed. Prince Johnson was the chief training officer of National Patriotic Front of Liberia. His torture of Samuel Doe was captured on video and circulated widely. There were serious human rights issues in this widely circulated video. This marked the end of the life and time of Samuel Doe, a military officer of native Liberian ancestry who staged a violent military coup to announce himself as president of Liberia, but who was also removed from office and eliminated in a violent military coup. Between 1980, when Samuel Doe took over the country as military head of state, up to the time of the leadership of Charles Taylor, Liberia had witnessed so much of violence, totalitarianism, wars, and huge loss of human lives and property. Liberia later returned to democracy following the resignation of Charles Taylor from the presidency of Liberia and the election of Helen Johnson Sirleaf, the first female president of Liberia and the first female president in Africa. The history of Liberia would not be complete without the mention of the presidency of Samuel Doe. He was loved by some and hated by others. Thanks for watching this episode of Back in History, and do remember to subscribe to the channel or follow the page for regular notification on every new video.